Hi, my name is Ann Hurst, and I will be presenting on adversarial science. In this presentation, I will go over what adversarial science is, when it is used, and we'll be reviewing mostly from two different papers, one called Adversarial Science from Professor Sane H. Knudsen, who is a professor in the University of Washington School of Law, and then also a paper, Adversarial Science, Conflict Resolution and Scientific Review in British Columbia's Central Coast, which is by Roger Alex Clapp and Cecilia Mortensen, who are in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University. So a good majority of the content will come from those two papers. And we'll look at an example of how adversarial science was applied in the British Columbia Central Coast. And then we'll review a little bit of the precautionary principle and how it applies in this situation, as well as then we'll look at an example of when adversarial science could be used in a debate that we are seeing in the media here in Utah currently. So to begin, let's just start off with what is adversarial science. Clapp and Mortensen in their article describe it as they say adversarial science refers to the public contestation of value-laden questions, deploying science and scientists as partisan weapons to discredit the claims of opposing interests as biased, subjective, or inaccurate. In other words, when emotions or politics, something with a value judgment, is part of the decision, adversarial science can be used to create a more neutral, objective environment for science to lead the discussion. And then in Knudsen's article, she refers to adversarial science as litigation science or junk science because it often has a bad name. It's because a lot of times it's associated with the tobacco industry's relentless use of science to manufacture uncertainty and avoid liability. So they think that something that adversarial science should just be disregarded because it was developed for litigation. But Knudsen thinks that adversarial science is an important informational asset that should and indeed must be embraced, according to her. So basically, adversarial science is intended to help create solutions when there are conflicts of interest or differing values. So, for example, in this graphic here, it's the FDA drug decision panel. And someone says, raise your hand if you have any financial conflicts of interest in this decision. And no one's raising their hand, but they've all got their hands or fingers crossed behind their back. So it's just this idea that there are different people involved, different stakeholders with different values, and we need to make sure that people who are involved in the decision-making process are unbiased and accountable for the decisions that they're making. Another example is this title of this newspaper article that says, Tobacco Giants Fund Vaping Studies. And the subtitle also says, Scientists Wooed in Charm Offensive. And I didn't read this article, but just from the title, I have a hard time believing that the results of the studies done on vaping will be unbiased, simply because of who is funding this research. And Clapp and Mortensen in their article say it is widely recognized that social values can influence the framing of questions and the interpretation of results, that funding can increase research outcomes, that situated research can support industry or interest groups, and that inconvenient results can be suppressed, which is what I think could potentially happen in a study such as this. I also really liked this graphic because I think it's a good example of the political environment we live in today. As we discussed in class, many politicians are more concerned about being liked in order to be reelected, so they aren't concerned with giving the right information and they just give the information that is convenient for their platform. And we know that they have bias because of they have bias caused by campaign promises or lobbyists more than anything that paid for their campaign. And the problem with this is that many Americans we rely on these politicians, the news media, the internet, etc., to give us information. And we hear something on the news, we read something on Facebook, and assume it's true, and a lot of time without corroborating the story. And this applies to many things other than scientific evidence, but it doesn't really matter which Kardashian is pregnant or who Taylor Swift is currently dating. But the things that affect our economy, our health, or the global population do matter, and we are often ignorant when it comes to that as well. I like this quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "Whenever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government." And I believe that this is part of the reason why our government is so flawed today. As Jordan pointed out in class, the ignorant, uninformed Americans are the ones who are electing the politicians who are making the important decisions. And the irony of this is that in an age of so much information, we're ignorant and uninformed about those things that really matter and make a difference. The internet makes the world smaller every day with easy access to information, which causes a large majority of the population to have strong opinions, sometimes about things they know little about. And it might just be because it's easier to publish opinions these days, but I feel that in general, the American people are becoming more diverse in our values and morals. And we don't always want the same things, and we need a voice of reason to help us reach solutions, which will probably require a compromise. And I believe that the only way we can come to solutions and reach a compromise is by using adversarial science. And Knudsen's essay describes some of the risks associated with adversarial science, but urges policymakers to embrace it because of the potential benefit and the outcomes that we can achieve with it. Knudsen's essay describes why adversarial science is vital to understanding the ecological effects of long-term toxic exposure through a process known as natural resource damage assessment, or the NRDA, which is when government trustees and corporate defendants fund intensive scientific research following major ecological disasters like oil spills. And during this process, lawyers engage scientists to advance advocacy positions, either to support or to defeat claims for natural resource damages. However, the science that emerges is adversarial, meaning there's still conflict. And it also suffers from conflicts of interest and perceptions of bias as well. But Knudsen says that surprisingly little scholarly attention has been given to the influence of litigation on NRDA science, or the implications of that influence on the broader scientific understanding of ecological harms. And she's hoping that her article will cast a bright light on adversarial science as a positive thing, using the scientific literature to expose the influence of litigation on NRDA science. And she offers solutions that both release adversarial science from traditional clouds of suspicion and allow adversarial science to inform public policy on the long-term harm for toxic exposure. We aren't going to get into the guts of Knudsen's article, but I wanted to talk a little about the natural resource damage assessment process. So as you can see in this graphic, there's 3 different phases. In phase 1, there's a pre-assessment done. So they're looking at jurisdiction, injury, so what was the damage that's occurred. And then in phase 2, there's an injury assessment and restoration planning. So evaluation injuries caused, estimate compensation owed, and develop a restoration plan. So that is essentially how much oil was dumped in and how much is that costing as far as whoever was affected by that, either environmental or business. And then phase 3 is restoration implementation, to undertake the projects as outlined in the restoration plan. So it's an ongoing thing. And one of the risks of this process that Knudsen identifies is the element of bias, which she also believes might just be a perception, that the bias might not be real. But she says that both sides of the research are performed by an organization that has something to lose or gain. So that's partly where the bias comes in. Because on the one hand, you've got government trustees who have an obligation to their constituents, and then on the other hand, you've got corporate defendants who have an obligation to their shareholders. But both parties have expectations to uphold, people to please, but they also operate under a different set of values. So a great example of this is the tobacco industry. And I want to show you a video that demonstrates a little bit better some of this conflict of interest. And this video is about the tobacco industry, but it also highlights the parallelism with climate change as well.
Is challenged on ABC's Good Morning America.
Yesterday, the government released a new report on smoking and health, which said that there is overwhelming evidence that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and is a major factor in heart disease. The tobacco industry says that there is no conclusive evidence that smoking causes cancer or heart disease. Yesterday, we discussed this new report with the United States Surgeon General, Julius Richmond, and John Pinney of Health, Education, and Welfare. And this morning, Bill Dwyer, who is Vice President of the Tobacco Institute, is with us, and Steve Bell joins our conversation from Washington. Good morning, Mr. Dwyer.
Good morning, David. Thank you very much.
First of all, the industry, naturally, the tobacco industry, wants people to smoke. If everybody quit smoking, then there wouldn't be an industry anymore.
We want them to be able to be free to choose. Right.
Make a choice,
right,
sure.
Right.
But if everybody made the choice to quit smoking, then of course there wouldn't, let's say, be any more tobacco industry. So it's in the interest of the industry to keep people smoking if they're going to continue to make a profit. Why should the public believe you as opposed to believing the Surgeon General and all the doctors and the reports from the government?
David, I don't think it's quite so much a matter of believing us versus someone else. It's believing what the facts are. And the facts shouldn't all come from a single source. It isn't really just our statement of contradiction or difference with the Surgeon General. There are many independent men and women of science who don't believe that the causal conclusion yet has been reached. David, we don't deny that there is statistical evidence. Smokers in greater number than non-smokers do fall victim to these various diseases. But we must remember that, for example, most smokers don't develop lung cancer, and certain non-smokers do as well. We think it's an open question.
Mr. Dwyer, Steve Bell in Washington, when you talk, though, about one source, as I understand it, you're not talking about one source. You're talking about the government compiling statistics from some 30,000 different studies done by all types of research people, and the government says that along with the people you cite, there is still overwhelming evidence.
Steve, the term overwhelming itself represents a judgment. There are differing points of view even within the expressions that are contained in the Surgeon General's report. Don't you think that there is perhaps a more fundamental question, or at least we do, and that is warning. The Surgeon General has determined there isn't a soul in this country, except perhaps a cave dweller, who could have missed that message. It's imprinted on the American awareness. At that point, our position is that individuals ought to be free to choose. Not children, by the way, adults. They've been put on notice, and whether it's aspirin or sweeteners or swordfish or now beer this week, as I heard you report, Steve, or pan-fried hamburgers last summer, there are so many incriminated items. We think Americans, after the information has been passed, ought to be able to come to their own conclusion.
So even when there is overwhelming evidence for something, there are still those who will disregard it because they have a different set of values. Even if the tobacco industry were to concede that smoking leads to lung cancer, they still operate under the premise that people get to choose. They make cigarettes because people choose to smoke them. The benefit of the NRDA process that Knudsen points out is the amount of research that takes place after an oil spill. The research might be paid for by biased parties, but it's still an opportunity to study the effects of oil spills. She says that at its core, then, the NRDA is an adversarial process. To be sure, because natural resource damages awards are used to restore injured public resources, the science developed to support NRDA claims may not reflexively conjure concerns of litigation science, at least not in any mass tort sense. Nonetheless, both governmental trustees and corporate defendants like BP and Exxon are driven by political and economic as well as scientific agendas. And as long as regulatory process creates or tolerates gaps in knowledge, logic dictates that adversarial science will be developed to offer proof of harm. So, in Knudsen's opinion, this is the strength of adversarial science. The more we disagree about something, the more research that will be done. If we all just agreed that tobacco wasn't a health risk, then no one would have ever done any research to prove that it was, potentially saving thousands of lives. So this is the biggest strength of adversarial science, is that extensive research that goes in by both parties, even though it's biased, into doing more research so we come to a more accurate conclusion. This is also a point that Clapp and Mortensen bring up in their essay. It says, when frontier regions become the subject of environmental planning, knowledge gaps are usually significant. Remapping these regions often highlights how little is known of them. Better knowledge can mean more, not less, uncertainty, a greater understanding of the depth of our ignorance, and greater caution in predicting the effects of policy alternatives. So we are going to dive more into the Clapp and Mortensen article. So I just wanted to read the abstract just as a summary because there won't be time to go over all of it. But it says, science plays paradoxical roles in environmental planning. As a process for generating and adapting knowledge of the biophysical environment to human use, it is essential to achieving sustainability. As the socially contested evaluation of competing claims to truth, however, adversarial science often becomes the focus of conflict in the planning process. British Columbia's Central Coast Land and Resource Management Plan, the CCLRMP, planning process took place amid industrial restructuring, market campaigns, and scientific disputes over the conservation of the world's largest remaining temperate rainforest. This article shows how adversarial science set the terms of the policy debate as well as the means for compromise. A multi-sector interdisciplinary information team played a key role in arriving at consensus by establishing a boundary organization that enabled bargaining and separated land use negotiations from disputes over the content, meaning, and implications of science. This article describes a really great example of how adversarial science can be used when there is a conflict in values. So just a brief outline of the Central Coast Land and Resource Management Plan. It was developed in 2 phases. In phase 1, from 1997 to 2001, so 4 years, the timber and conservation sectors drew on science to justify or challenge existing practices and to dispute each other's data, analysis, and selection of indicators. Then in phase 2, which lasted 2 years, they witnessed a shift of adversarial science away from the negotiating table and into working groups of the Coast Information Team. So they establish their data and then they use that data to come up with a conclusion. And one way they managed this was through the Coast Information Team, or the CIT. And the CIT was a collaborative multi-party team and interagency technical team. The scientists and technicians working for my environmental groups, the forest industry, government, and academia. And it was directed by a multi-sector management committee accountable to both the scientific and political realms. So it had provincial government, First Nations, NGOs, forest industries, and coastal communities involved in this team. And it also shared funding to avoid the domination of research priorities. So the funding came from the same source, for good reason there. And the CIT did not eliminate the partisan use of science, but channeled it into a boundary organization with a smaller, more expert audience charged with assimilating the dueling priorities, models, and databases, and combining the principles of independent scientific review with the knowledge of dependent scientists. Essentially, their goal was the demarcation of good science from bad science. And that was their main goal, was to produce information acknowledged by all parties as legitimate. And the process wasn't perfect, but as CIT members, they were asked to promise to first contribute as independent individuals, unconstrained by policies or positions of their employer or their constituency, their community or interest group, to keep that conflict of interest out, and then to also disclose significant influences based on their values or assumptions or judgments that they bring to the process. And one participant of the process said, it was easier to recognize independence when participants liked the message. When they disliked the message, it was not difficult to find fault with the messenger. And despite the CIT's attempt to identify value judgments, several participants felt that it remained tainted by a political bias. But there was still a lot of spin going on, lots of ways to take information and twist it around to represent your interest. So not perfect, but a good attempt to eliminate bias as much as possible and to get all stakeholders involved. So some of the key outcomes of Phase 1 were that all parties committed to establish a coast information team and adopt ecosystem-based management. There was 20 intact watersheds that were designated as protected areas, doubling the protected land base to 21%. To protect visual quality, 14% of the region was recommended for special management. Logging was deferred in 68 watersheds, designated as option areas. First Nations would lead in deciding land uses in 4 zones, which was about 1.4% of the region. The province and First Nations would conduct government-to-government negotiations after Phase 2. And a $35 million transitional fund would mitigate job loss and promote economic diversification. And then some of the key outcomes of Phase 2 was a consensus land use map, the expansion of the protected areas network to 33% of the region, 2 multiple watershed grizzly bear management areas, and then visual quality areas for tourist zones near the Inside Passage, and funding for ecosystem-based management in 67% of the region. Clapp and Mortensen say, "We argue that the CIT has achieved limited but important success in conflict resolution in that it confirms several principles in the design of institutional frameworks for moving beyond a battle of the sciences. Those lessons are to employ a pluralist model of science that does not promise consensus, include both complementary and embedded scientists, and develop a shared source boundary objects." And just to clarify, a boundary object provide a common structure for the participants so that groups with different interests can work cooperatively. In this example, the key boundary object was a shared spatial database, so that all analysis had to be performed from the same data source by both sides of the argument. One quote from Knudsen's article that I liked was, "Adversarial science is a hazard when key technical facts demand the use of scientific experts, and those experts present targeted specific scientific conclusions to sway political outcomes. Adversarial science emerges when one group's science is used to challenge another's to advance an interest in a policy debate. If conservation biology yields one answer and forest economics yields another, which science is the most important one?" And this question really resonated with me. Which science is the most important one? So in response to Knudsen's comment, I think that the elements of the precautionary principle should be applied here. In formulating the precautionary principle that we reviewed in class, Neil A. Manson says that the precautionary principle is supposed to provide guidance with respect to cases in which our scientific knowledge of the harmful effects of a proposed activity is significantly incomplete. So the main structure of the precautionary principle has three parts. One, to consider all the possible damages that can be caused by an event, and then to determine how much knowledge we have as to whether or not a certain activity is the cause of that said damage, and then to seek a remedy to prevent the damage caused by that activity. And Knudsen wants to know which science is the most important one, because people have differing values. I don't think that the question of which is more important can be answered, but the precautionary principle can help create a cost-benefit analysis based on possible damages forecasted by each side of science. A great example of where the precautionary principle could be applied, as well as the process outlined in Clapp and Mortensen's article of Adversarial Science, is in the Bears Ears National Monument, which was designated in December of 2016, so just last year, a year ago, by President Barack Obama. And this has been a heated debate amongst many Utahns as well as people throughout the nation. And I want to dissect a little bit the process by which this monument was designated with some of the principles I have covered in this presentation. Let's start by reading a little bit about the position of both sides of the debate. So, for the monument, in July of 2015, leaders from 5 tribes founded the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, representing the historic consortium of several tribal nations united in the effort to conserve the Bears Ears cultural landscape. The 5 nations are committed to working together. A total of 30 tribes have expressed support for protecting the Bears Ears region for future generations of Americans. Native American peoples are also seeking active engagement in future management of the area. And this is from the Bears Ears Coalition website. And then from the position against the monument, they say, last year, President Barack Obama gave in to pressure from corporate interests, extreme environmental groups, and out-of-state tribal leaders by designating the 1.35 million acre Bears Ears National Monument. This decision was not about sensible land management policy or the well-being of locals whose culture and livelihood depend on public lands. Instead, it was a narrow-minded and unilateral decision that ignored grassroots Native American groups, local and state elected representatives, and the people of San Juan County. They deserve better. And this comes from the rescindbearsears.org website. So I've tried to identify some of the main values identified in both groups. So those that are for the monument, there's tribal nations that are united in the effort, which is a really great thing. The conservation of Bears Ears cultural landscape. They want to protect the Bears Ears region for future generations of Americans. They want to preserve sacred relics and ceremonial sites. And they want the Native American peoples with active engagement in management. And then some of the values of those that are against the monument. They want local management without the influence of out-of-state government, corporate, or tribal leaders. They want a sensible land management policy. They want the well-being of locals whose cultural and livelihood depends on public lands to be considered. and then also the inclusion of grassroots Native American groups, local and state elected representatives, and the people of San Juan County, who they say are the primary stakeholders in this decision. Now I want to paint a picture of how the monument was designated in 2016 and the process that followed that led to the announcement Trump made last week to reduce the size of this monument. And this is just a very high-level summary, and I'm not going to profess to know what amount of research went into the decision at either time, but I just wanted to paint a picture of the people that were involved in the process in both cases. So, in 2016, Secretary Sally Jewell went to San Juan County, and she went camping with the Intertribal Coalition, which is the Diné-Bikéyah. She hosted an open forum 20 plus miles outside of town, and then she bussed in a lot of non-locals who were giving food, money, t-shirts, and then she went hiking with the representatives from the NGOs, the Friends of Cedar Mesa being a main one, and then she spent 45 minutes with the county commissioner. And then in 2017, Secretary Ryan Zinke came and he met with the elected local government officials. He spoke with the Native American tribes, the local Native American tribes. He met with local residents. He spent 2.5 hours flying over the monument. He rode horses across the monument ground. And then he spent an hour and a half with the Diné-Bikéyah, who he pointed out are not elected officials. And he did also meet with the Friends of Cedar Mesa NGO as well. So in 2016, the local government officials and local residents were upset because they had essentially been ignored. But then in 2017, the Diné-Bikéyah and the NGOs felt ignored. So I think that both sides have valid needs and concerns to bring to the table, but in both cases, the solutions were discussed independent from each other. And I'll admit, being from San Juan County myself and knowing a lot more of the politics that occurred during the process, I feel that Zinke's approach was much more appropriate and democratic. He did meet with the NGOs and the Diné-Bikéyah, but he spent most of his time with the local elected officials who have been elected to represent the voice of the people. So, putting the debate of whether the land should be protected or not, putting that aside, I want to outline what I think would have been more ideal process to reach a decision about the monument based on the concepts of the precautionary principle and the adversarial science process in the Clapham-Morrison article. As the discussion for a new monument began, the Secretary of the Interior should have held a meeting with all stakeholders in a neutral location. All stakeholders includes a very similar list to the stakeholders in the CCLRMP example from the Clapham-Morrison article, which the primary stakeholders would be the Native American tribes, the federal government, the state of Utah, labor, major oil and coal companies, local residents, recreation, wildlife recreation, small businesses, and tourism. Some of the boundaries that should have been established possibly could be which data sources to use and which Native American tribes should have a voice. Not all of the Native American tribes in the part of the Intertribal Coalition are local Native American tribes. Many of them live hundreds of miles from the monument boundaries. And then a list of values should have been established and a cost-benefit analysis completed, recognizing that there would have to be a compromise at some point. Then a task force similar to the CIT could have been created to finalize a recommendation. If this process had been followed from the beginning, there would have been much less conflict, and the efforts from both sides could have worked together to define boundaries that both could live with. Instead of fighting against each other, they could have joined forces and come up with something much more appropriate. So, in conclusion, as we have seen from the example of the Central Coast Land and Resource Management Plan and the Bears National Monument, adversarial science can and should play a large part in the decision process when there's emotions or politics as are part of the decision. And some science is just done for the sake of science, but when decisions of scientific research affect our lives, science cannot be an independent field. It has to include stakeholders in a collaborative, non-biased way. And I strongly believe that this is the only solution to climate change, GMOs, animal testing, cloning, eugenics, and so many other controversial topics of today. We have to get people involved. It's a longer process. It takes more time. It requires patience and collaboration, but it's the only solution to creating real solutions for those different issues that we face. Thank you for watching.